This evening's Bell Lecture will be recorded, not only the main event, but the Q&A that follows the lecture. So once we get to that point, please wait until I and the Assistant Curator, Ann Good, can come to you with a microphone so you can ask your question using the mic so that people who watch this later online can hear your question. At this time, I'd also like to thank the associates of the James Ford Bell Library for their support, as well as the University of Minnesota Library's Special Events team. And now, without further ado, it is my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Professor Michael Gaudio. Professor Gaudio is the Beverly and Richard Fink Professor of Liberal Arts in our very own Department of Art History at the University of Minnesota. He earned his PhD at Stanford University, and in addition to many articles and book chapters, is the author of 3 monographs: Engraving the Savage, The New World and Techniques of Civilization, The Bible in Printed Image in Early Modern England, Little Gidding and the Pursuit of Scriptural Harmony, and most recently, Sound, Image, Silence, Art and the Oral Imagination in the Atlantic World. His work has been recognized with numerous awards. He was a McKnight Presidential Fellow, a Paul Mellon Visiting Center Fellow for the Center for Advanced Study at the Visual Arts in Washington, D.C., and he was named a Tyson Scholar for the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in spring of 2017. This evening, his talk, Speaking Images, The Art of Travel Literature in Early Modern Europe, explores a dynamic between sight and sound in the art of early modern travel literature by focusing on 2 popular and lavishly illustrated publications: Jean de Lary's History of a Voyage of the Land of Brazil, published in 1592, and Caspar Barlia's History of Brazil, 1647. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Michael Gaudio.
Thank you very much, Maggie, for the generous introduction, and thank you also to Maggie and to Ann Good of the Bell Library, and to the associates of the James Ford Bell Library for the invitation and for supporting this this talk and the exhibition that's downstairs that it is tied to. I've always enjoyed attending this lecture, the James Ford Bell Lecture, and it's really an honor to be delivering it. So thank you for that opportunity, and to be doing it in person, which is great. It's been online for the past 2 years, so I'm happy to bring it back into this space and with a crowd. So the topic of my lecture this evening, again, is occasioned by the wonderful exhibition downstairs that Maggie has put together on the art of the travel narrative, for which she's selected a variety of remarkable text from the James Ford Bell Library's collections, a really broad swath of illustrated European travel literature, dating over a range, I think, between the 15th and the 19th centuries. And most of the images that I'll be showing you here are taken from or appear in books that are included in that exhibition. Some of these materials take the form of unpublished manuscripts, including Ambrosio Bembo's Travel and Journal Through Part of Asia. And in fact, the image that you're seeing at the bottom of the screen is kind of being used as the sort of the poster image for the exhibition, as you see on the window there. This book is, this manuscript is an account of a 4-year journey undertaken by Ambrosio Bembo, a member of an illustrious Venetian family who traveled to the Levant and even to Iran and as far as India. And on the screen here are 2 of the illustrations that appear in that manuscript. So on his journeys while he was in the city of Isfahan, Bembo had met the French artist Guillaume Joseph Grelot, who was actually stranded there in Isfahan. He was in the service of this a stingy merchant and traveler who was refusing to pay him, so he was kind of stuck in the city of Isfahan. And so Bembo seized the opportunity and hired Grillo to make drawings for his own travel account. And so here on the screen you see Grillo's impressive view of the city of Aleppo, along with a drawing on the right of the women of Aleppo as they dress when they leave the house. And it's a remarkable document. It's truly one of the treasures of the Bell Library collection. But for a long time, it existed only in manuscript form. It was only recently published in 2005. Grillo, however, who was more ambitious than Bembo, or maybe just more in need of money, those are not mutually exclusive, he decided to publish his pictures. And he continued on his travels to make, after the journey with Bembo, and continued to make more illustrations. And then in 1680, he had a number of these drawings from his travels engraved, and he published them along with his own extensive commentary and accounts of his adventures, as the book that you see on the screen here, the Relation Nouvelle d'un Voyage de Constantinople, and dedicated it to Louis XIV. Here you see the engraving of his view of the Topkapi Palace. And then this book immediately went through several editions, and 3 years later, after the initial publication in French, it was published in English as A Late Voyage to Constantinople. And so you see that on the screen, and then the same view as it appeared in that book, the Topkapi Palace labeled the Grand Seraglio. His translator and publisher for this edition, John Phillips, notes that it was Louis XIV himself who urged Grillo to bring his work to press. The King of France was so pleased with Grillo's drawings, Phillips writes, that he commanded the author to make them public. So as impressive as Bembo's unpublished manuscript is, I'm actually, in this talk, I'm more interested in this making public of travelers' experiences in early modern Europe. As more and more Europeans, like Bembo and Grillo, traveled to distant locales, we see this explosion of travel accounts being published in the 16th and 17th centuries that harness the new technology of printing, along with the reproductive technologies of woodcut, engraving, and etching, in order to satisfy this growing and insatiable desire for new reports, both verbal and visual, about different parts of the world. And Grillo was tapping into this desire with his publications. Now, the images in these published accounts do many things. They report on how foreigners behave, how their clothing and other habits are both like and unlike those of Europeans. They report on the commodities that are found in these places, on sacred sites, landscapes, the flora and fauna of these regions. The special claim of the traveler, of course, is that I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. First-hand travel accounts had been appearing for some time, of course. The travels of Marco Polo and the travels of Sir John Mandeville, for example, were circulating in manuscript in the 14th century. But print, and along with it, this capacity to reproduce images along with the text, helped foreground the visual evidence itself, and to reach a wider audience, of course, as well. Erhard Roywick, the artist who illustrated an early printed travel account, Bernard von Bredenbach's Peregrinatio in Terram Sanctam, or A Journey into the Holy Land, of 1486, shows us the sites, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on the left here, as well as the people. So on the right-hand side, you see a group of Saracens, as he calls them, in various modes of dress, as well as an Arabic alphabet shown below them. And then in the middle, the animals of the Holy Land. We have a giraffe, a crocodile, some goats, a camel being led by a monkey, a salamander, and then a unicorn. And we might rightly have some skepticism as to whether Bredenbach actually saw a unicorn. But what's important here is the claim that accompanies this image. Down at the bottom, I think I can point to it. I got a little laser pointer with my finger. The claim right there, down there at the bottom in Latin, which translates, "These animals are truly depicted just as we saw them in the Holy Land." Right? And it's a claim that we see again and again and again in the travel narrative, right? And one that's given a wonderful visual form in Grelot's own view of Aleppo in the Bembo manuscript, in which he includes himself, so you can see a detail of the highlighted area there, where he includes himself, his back to us, in the process of making the very drawing that we see here. Right? He was there. He witnessed this. So there's very good reason to use this as a kind of emblem for the exhibition downstairs, really foregrounding that special claim that's behind the travel account. So in short, the illustrated travel account draws our attention to the increasing power and authority of the eye in early modern Europe as the wider world was surveyed, cataloged, and in general laid out before viewers like a picture, as Grelot lays out the city of Aleppo for us here. Now, all that said, we need to keep in mind that when the travel writer declares, "I saw this," or "I witnessed that," and points to a picture in the text, he's making his appeal to the eye through language. Right? And for that reason, focusing only on the authority of the eye makes it easy to forget how deeply intertwined these pictures are with words. And it's this aspect of the art of travel literature on which I'd like to focus our attention today in the works that I'm going to talk about. That is to say, on the capacity of these images, not simply to show us the world, but to make it speak. The image in the travel narrative serves as a kind of bridge across which the author's words voyage between distant lands and the here and now of the reader encountering the text. As more and more narratives came off the presses in Europe, and as reading public's experience of distant lands therefore became more and more mediated by print, the more important it became for audiences to hear the narrator's voice speaking through the text, directly to them. And pictures played an important role in that process. So just take the one that I put on the screen here. This is another image by Grelot that was engraved for his text for the late voyage to Constantinople. And you can see that the image shows the various postures of Turks at prayer. So showing us the visual disposition of the body at different moments in the process of prayer. But when viewed in relationship to the text, there's more to it than that visual aspect. Grelot calls our attention to the actual prayers from the Quran that are said at each stage. And the image helps us to hear these prayers, whose full text in translation is given on the facing page in those sections in italics. And so what I'd like to do now is to explore a couple of instances in which the images in early modern European travel accounts speak to us, I think, in particularly interesting and complex ways. And so my examples are going to take us from the Levant to the New World, and more specifically to two accounts of travel to Brazil, one of them published in the late 16th century and the other about 50 years later. And I'll begin with this text on the screen here. You see the title page on the left and this image on the right. The image was engraved by the Flemish printmaker and publisher Theodore de Brie and made for his enormously successful series of books that he titled America, which was a series of illustrated Protestant travel accounts of to the New World. You're looking at So that image on the right, by the way, is colored. It's a hand-colored version of a print that he made for one of these volumes. It pictures a dance originally witnessed by the Calvinist missionary Jean de Lery, who spent a year among the Tupinamba in Brazil and wrote a narrative of his experiences, a history of a voyage to the land of Brazil. And Debris included Larry's narrative in the third part of America, and it's the title page to that you see on the left. You see the title page to the German edition here, published in 1593. It was published in Latin the previous year. And Debris created a number of engravings for this volume, drawing upon the woodcuts that accompanied the original 1578 edition of Larry's text. So the engraving of 16 Tupinamba dancers standing in a circle, as you can see here, is based on a much simpler woodcut from that earlier edition of Larry's book. And so you can see how Debris significantly expands on his model, transforming the single figure in back here into three figures here at the center, and transforming that single figure in the front to 16 figures here in the circle. And then enclosing all of those figures now within the interior of a grass hut. It's an image that reached a wide public. Debris' book was very popular, and one that needs to be looked at and listened to in relationship to Larry's text, which describes a climactic moment in the narrative when the author witnesses this Tupinamba dance. So let's look a little bit more closely at that image. Leaning forwards, the dancers move their feet rhythmically, repetitiously. They wear little clothing, though nearly everyone is adorned with feathers that are glued directly to their skin. All the figures show the same uniform stance. The right foot of each of those on the near side of the circle is raised slightly above ground level. You see here where they cast a shadow about where that foot is about to fall. And so we can imagine the sound that's about to come, right? The stomp as they all drop their feet on the dirt in unison. This is how Larry describes it. They stood close to each other without holding hands or stirring from their place, but arranged in a circle, bending forward, keeping their bodies slightly stiff, moving only the right leg and foot with the right hand placed on the buttocks and the left hand and arm hanging. In that posture, they sang and danced. The rhythmic, stationary movement of the men is regulated by the trio at the center, who are dressed differently, as you can see, from the rest. In contrast to the bald pates of the dancers, these men, who are called karai, Larry tells us, a type of great shaman, wear feathered headdresses. And while the dancers are bare except for the feathers attached to their bodies, these men wear heavy feathered robes and a feathered belt. Clearly men of authority, they wield tokens of their power. The two at the edges lean out towards the circle and blow large puffs of smoke through long tobacco pipes, in the process enveloping dancing figures who seem to be anointed with this intoxicating vapor. Larry describes how these shamans, while blowing tobacco smoke on the dancers, would say to them, "So that you may overcome your enemies, receive all of you the spirit of strength." In addition, each of these central figures holds in his hand a large ovoid object, a dried gourd, attached to a stick and decked with its own feathered headdress. This they call the maraca, Larry tells us, and in order to make the spirit speak through it, they make it sound incessantly. The anthropomorphic forms of the maracas echo the heads of the three central figures, and particularly that middle figure, who is really the pivot of the whole composition. All of this, that is to say the viewers of the engraving, witness from a privileged position as we look into this enclosed space but remain unnoticed by the dancers. And indeed, as he describes in his narrative, Larry himself first peeks into the house, unseen, through a hole that he makes in the wall. And that opening is in fact recorded in Debris' engraving in the upper left corner here. It's a little addition that he's made here as a reminder of how we are meant to see. Right? This is a kind of a peep show, reminding us that we share Larry's privileged position of eyewitness. But Larry, that's not enough for Larry. He wants to get even closer. Seeing alone is insufficient. So compelled by the sounds of the dance that he hears, he and his companions, he's accompanied by two Norman interpreters, Norman sailors who had been in Brazil for some time and learned the language and served as interpreters for Larry. They enter physically into the hut, and we see the men tucked into the upper right corner. These observers, still unnoticed by the dancers, engage in conversation as the figure on the far right points to the dancers with his hand, this figure on the right here, while the other two hold out their hands in gestures that signify an animated conversation about the ritual that they bear witness to. Larry is presumably the figure in the center who wears what is perhaps a missionary's robe. Here then is our surrogate, right? It's through his eyes and ears that we bear witness to this scene. And Larry's description of the dance is one of the most memorable in the text. As I said, it's this climactic moment in the narrative. It revolves around the power of these karai to hold the common people under their bewitching power, making them believe that a spirit speaks to them through their maracas. But his account of this ceremony is of interest not only for this Protestant critique of religious superstition, it's also a particularly evocative passage in which Larry is himself transported by the experience of the dance, is enraptured by the chant of these Tupinamba men as these men are themselves enraptured by the sound of their speaking gourd. I stood there transported with delight, he writes. Whenever I remember it, my heart trembles, and it seems their voices are still in my ears. And in fact, Larry is so ravished by the sound of this chant that he feels compelled to reproduce it in musical staff notation, which appears below the image and on the same page in Debris' version. This is an effort to make our experience of the dance visualized above even more immediate by showing us its melody, the regularized descending repetition of a single sound, hurrah, hurrah, hurrah. 16 notes echoing the 16 bodies arranged in the circle above, and it's these notes experienced in their pure aural presence that the bodies are meant to conjure for us. Now, when he's inside the hut, Larry asks the other men, the Norman interpreters, about the meaning of the chants. And they tell him that at the beginning of the songs, they had uttered long laments for their dead ancestors. But by the end, they had taken comfort in the assurance that after their death, they would go join them, their ancestors that is, behind the high mountains where they would dance and rejoice with them. Larry is here referring to the Tupinamba belief in a land without evil, which was a central component of Tupi religion. The Karai would lead massive rituals in which they called upon people to give up a sedentary existence and undertake arduous migrations in search of a mythic paradise, the land without evil. And they did this not by proselytizing or doomsaying, but through a poetic speech that they called beautiful words. And these are the words that appear below Debris' engraving, translated into musical notation. And they're words that should be understood in contrast to Larry's own speech inside the hut when he speaks to his interpreters so that he can learn the lesson of the dance, so he can make it into an object of knowledge. that kind of instrumental use of language is very different from the language that bewitches Larry as pure sound. And this is precisely the effect beautiful words were supposed to have. Right? These words were, in fact, fundamentally about their own sound. They were an entirely metaphorical speech without nouns, the purpose of which was to restore bonds between human beings and their mythical ancestors. As the anthropologist Hélène Clastra writes, they're words intended for chant, not for knowledge. But the sound of the ceremony we witness in Debris' engraving involves more than just beautiful words. The cult of the maraca is also central to the religion of the land without evil, and so the maraca's incessant sound, while far from beautiful to Larry's ears, demands our attention as well. So, the significance of the maracas within Tupinamba society had been noted since the earliest European accounts. Hans Staden was the first to mention them in his 1557 book on Brazil, The True History and Description of a Land Belonging to the Wild, Naked, Savage, Man-Munching People. That's the most recent translation of the title. And as far as I'm aware, Staden provides us with the first European illustration of a maraca. He does recognize the importance of the maraca within Tupinamba religion, though he mistakes its actual function. As he succinctly puts it, they put their faith in a thing shaped like a pumpkin, which is a claim that reflects Staden's belief that the maraca is itself a god for the Tupinamba, rather than a mediator that affects communication between a human and a spirit world. Maracas were used by the Karai during ceremonies like the ones that we see in Debris' engraving, and for other purposes as well, whenever it was necessary to call upon the spirit world. It resembled a human head with hair, that is to say feathers, and a mouth here. As Staden notes, they cut a hole in it like a mouth, filling it with small stones so that it rattles. So we see that mouth in Staden's woodcut, but we actually don't see it in the Debris engraving. It could even have ears and eyes, and it sat atop an arrow that took the place of a neck. The Karai would breathe tobacco smoke through it so that it came out the orifices, and they would also speak through it. And when they did this, it was understood that a spirit was speaking through the maraca. In his account of the Tupinamba, the Calvinist, Larry, notes the way that the Karai use maracas to dupe the people, making them believe these objects are living beings that require food and drink. Larry says of these Karai with their sacred rattles that you can find no better comparison than to the bell ringers that accompany those impostors who, exploiting the credulity of our simple folk over here, carry from place to place the reliquaries of St. Anthony or St. Bernard and other such instruments of idolatry. So comparing the Karai to those idolatrous Catholic friars wandering around the European countryside. The title page to Debris' third volume, which includes not only Larry's text, but Staden's text as well, includes the maraca as its central image. So here, you can see it at the top, it becomes the centerpiece of a savage and therefore inverted social order, a Tupinamba dancer on either side falling prostrate before it in idolatrous devotion. So Larry may fall under the spell of the beautiful words of the Tupinamba, which is perhaps understandable in a Protestant who locates truth in the spoken word of God, but he has no tolerance for the base speech of this all-too-material object. So Debris' engraving leaves us in an ambivalent position with respect to the sounds of the dance. On the one hand, it presents itself to us as an unveiling of religious superstition, in which we experience this dance as a liberation of our own senses from the smoke and the false speech of the Karai, who hold the dancers under their spell. But on the other hand, this eminently rational visualization of the dance enacts its own magic by conjuring up the sounds that captivated Larry. And I don't think it's going too far to say that Debris puts his image before the viewer and shakes it, as if it were itself a maraca, so that he might leave the sounds of a Tupinamba dance ringing in our ears. So if that hole in the wall is one figuration of the viewer's standpoint before the image, right, standing for that purely visual mastery of the event. Then the maraca at the center, held by that figure, those figures at the center, is a second, competing figuration. It stands for the image that speaks to us in order to enchant us with its magic. Now, this is an exceptional image in many respects, but its appeal to a sensory experience that exceeds the distanced optical command that Gaudio models for us, the way in which that hole in the wall is not enough so the image asks us to walk bodily into the hut and hear the dance. This is an appeal that many of the pictures that accompany early modern travel narratives make. And especially when we read those images in relationship to the text. But not all pictures are equally loud, and I want to turn now to some pictures where this would seem to be the case, pictures that are perhaps more in line with Gaudio's landscape than Debris' image, and which illustrate another account of Brazil, this one published in Amsterdam in 1647. And it's one of the finest and most richly illustrated books published in 17th century Holland. Published at the presses of Johannes Blau, entitled The Rerum per Octennium in Brasilia, or The History of 8 Years in Brazil under the governorship of Count Johann Maurits of Nassau. And you see Maurits's portrait on the right, taken from this volume. And Maurits is the first of three important figures I want to briefly introduce here for you, because all three of these figures involved in the publication of this book. Johann Maurits had been appointed in 1636 by the Dutch West India Company as Governor General of Dutch Brazil. And his task was to restore order and extend the West India Company's holdings in Brazil, which at this time was the most important producer of sugar for Europe. He returned to Amsterdam in 1644 and shortly afterwards arranged for the publication of this volume that describes and glorifies his endeavors in the New World. Now, as I said, it's a lavishly illustrated book containing numerous maps of Brazil, as well as landscape etchings by the Haarlem painter Frans Post. You see Post's a printed version of Post's portrait on the right after a painting by Frans Hals. Post was part of a team of artists and scholars that Johann Maurits had hired to carry out the systematic description of Brazil and its flora and fauna and peoples. And Post's job was to record the landscape and topography of the areas conquered by Maurits and to record military events and the sites associated with them. He produced a number of landscape paintings as well as 31 drawings that were then etched and published in this volume. And then finally, Johann Maurits arranged for the Dutch humanist, Caspar Barlaeus, to write this book. And Barlaeus himself had not been to Brazil, but he was a logical choice to write its history given his reputation for eloquence and his prominence in Dutch letters. He was professor of philosophy at the recently established Amsterdam Athenaeum, as well as a sought-after Latin poet. And it's Barlaeus who, employing his skills as orator and writer, gives a voice to the Brazilian landscape depicted by Post. And again, it's this question of voice that I want to think about, because like the other prints of the New World that circulated in early modern books, Post's engravings serve as vehicles for and incitements to writing and speech. And surely this is a matter of some interest to the historian, right? To Barlaeus, whose task was to enliven Dutch Brazil through his own eloquence, and to me as an art historian as I attempt to lend my own voice to these pictures. But I have my work cut out for me because Post's landscapes of Brazil are some of the most insistently silent works in Dutch art. So consider, for example, his view of the mouth of the Paraiba River, labeled in a banner at the top here. And I'll come back to these interesting banners in just a little bit. But as you can see, little happens in this landscape. A few small figures mingle in the foreground, a Dutchman conversing with three darker-skinned women, presumably slaves. To the right, in the middle distance, we find even smaller figures fishing by the shore with a large net. And then beyond them, in the river mouth here, a Dutch man of war. And then as one follows the horizon from left to right, we see three forts, originally Portuguese forts that were captured by the Dutch. So Fort Margareta right here, labeled by the letter A, Fort Restinga farther back, labeled by B, and way back here in the far, far distance, tiny, tiny Fort Boreale. And then there's the sky, which fills fully 3/5 of the picture. So that despite all the details of the landscape, this engraving can be described as mostly a picture of nothing. One scholar has described Post's early Brazil landscapes as arguably the airiest in Dutch art. And indeed, the sense of distance is overwhelming. Post offers the new world to us, clarifies it visually, but he does so by putting it beyond the reach of any sense but vision. Erik Larson, the author of a study of Post published in the 1960s, argued that in order to achieve this sense of distance in his landscapes, the artist must have been looking through the wrong end of a telescope. And the argument seems far-fetched, which it is. But Larson had a point. If the reversed telescope fails to hold up as an actual explanation of Post's practice, it does offer a good metaphor for the optical effect of his landscapes. And I'm not alone in remarking on the quietude of Post's landscapes. One distinguished historian, J.H. Eliot, has described them as a fresh, if somewhat muted, image of the New World. And muted is something of a favorite word for scholars describing Post's works. Others have characterized it as calming and quiet, placid, serene. Right? These are the typical descriptors that one encounters. And one dwells all the more on the silence because these landscapes were the sites of a great deal of noise. A noise that we should understand in the broadest sense as history. That is to say, the events that occurred in these landscapes, and indeed whose very occurrence is the occasion for these landscapes, and yet there are historical events that don't seem to be of these landscapes, or at least not fully. Barlaeus tells us that the Paraiba River was the site of ferocious fighting in the 1630s when this area was conquered by the Dutch. The forts and the man of war serve as reminders of that military activity, but war is now past. This is a pacified landscape. Post is not alone among landscape artists in creating this sense of tranquility amidst violent conflict. We find the same willful exclusion of a historical event in landscapes by equally serene Dutch painters, perhaps Vermeer above all. Lawrence Weschler, in a moving 1995 essay for The New Yorker on the hearings of the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal, writes about traveling back and forth in The Hague between the tribunal and the gallery in the Maurits house that holds Vermeer's view of Delft, which you see here. And there, in the very house that was built for Johann Maurits while he was undertaking his military campaigns in Brazil, Weschler finds an escape from the stories of unspeakable wartime violence in Bosnia that he hears at the tribunal as he takes in this, what he calls this image of unalloyed civic peace and quiet. Yet he also reflects on the fact that when Vermeer made this painting, all Europe was Bosnia. The peace and quiet one finds in Vermeer's view of Delft, in other words, is an invention of Dutch landscape representation, a creative act of silencing history. Inventing Peace is the title of Weschler's essay. Now, if I'm making much of the silence of Post's landscapes, and here are two more, Cape Santo Agostino on the left, and the village of Seranaim on the right. If I'm making much of this silence, it's because there is something about these prints, and indeed about landscape representation more generally, that warrants it. And I'm referring here to an aspect of landscape that goes beyond a merely figurative muting of the din of war and historical event. I'm referring to the way in which a landscape can silence a beholder, right? Making it difficult to find the words that would make landscape into history or narrative. And this is a quality that distinguishes landscape from the type of picture that had been praised in humanist commentary on the visual arts since Leon Battista Alberti's De Pictura of 1435. And I think we can take Debris' image of dancing Tupinamba as exemplary in many respects of this kind of picture. For Alberti, a good picture is like a good oration. Right? And indeed, Alberti's advice to the artist is often directly modeled on Cicero's advice to the orator. And above all, Alberti insists upon the importance of the istoria, which we could define as a story treated by the artist with a clarity that powerfully moves the beholder, in the same way that a well-told history moves a reader or a listener. I look at a good painting, Alberti writes, with as much pleasure as I take in the reading of a good historia. Both are the work of painters. One paints with words, the other tells the story with his brush. And this idea of the painting as historia is a powerful one in the sense that it binds the sensual experience of the picture to its translation into words, and indeed into the beholder's own eloquent speech. Knowing the story from Jean Delarey's narrative in this case, and affected by Theodore Debris' powerful narrative presentation, we should be able to find the words to express its impact on us. But if Alberti conceived of the picture as a stage for the historia, landscape leaves us instead with an empty, silent stage. Independent landscape emerges in the 16th century precisely as the exclusion of the event, the historia, the argument. The term that Renaissance writers used for landscape was par ergon, a word that they took from the Roman historian and encyclopedist Pliny. And the word means an accessory. Right? Landscape, in other words, is understood as that which is secondary to and dependent upon a primary subject. So as late as 1656, the English lexicographer Thomas Blunt still defines landscape in this way. All that which in a picture is not of the body or argument thereof, he writes, is landscape, par ergon, or bywork. Bywork is just a literal English translation of that Greek word par ergon, the thing that exists by the work but is not the work itself. And I show you Montaigne, a crucifixion by Montaigne to just kind of illustrate this point. So Blunt continues, in the picture of Christ upon the rood, the two thieves, the Blessed Virgin Mary and St. John, are the argument, but the city Jerusalem, the country about, the clouds and the like are landscape. He uses the Dutch word from which landscape comes. So understood in these terms, landscapes like posts are pictures without an argument, right? Pictures that no longer speak. Maybe we could consider the foreground conversation or the fisherman as a kind of argument, but this is accessory, right? This is the stuff of the par ergon. In the absence of an argument, background has simply become foreground, and in this regard, it's in the very nature of landscape to frustrate the interpreter, because we stand dumb in front of a picture without an historia. But I don't think we can leave it at that. Posts' landscapes are embedded in a narrative, an historia. And the desire to make them speak remains. It lingers at the margins in those silent forts, in that tiny man of war on the water, as the specter of events that have been pushed off the stage. And it lingers especially for the reader, as well for the scholar like myself, who wants and needs the Brazil of Barlaes's book to be something more than just what is seen, right? Who wants the object to speak. And this is where Barlaes comes in. The writer who brings to Brazil the skills of the humanist orator. Barlaes compares Johann Maurits's military exploits to those of the ancients. So whoever reads this, Barlaeus writes, will recall those commanders of antiquity who invaded the enemy's territory to turn back the tide of war from their own land. So in other words, just as a great commander like Scipio Africanus pursued his Carthaginian enemies across the sea, in the same way Johann Maurits pursued his Spanish enemies across the sea. But the Dutch haven't simply emulated the ancients in their conquests. We have far surpassed the Romans, Barlaeus continues, for the regions to which we go are immensely distant, and the men we fight are far more savage and uncivilized. So the point here is that as an historian, Barlaeus places himself within a tradition of ancient historians like Livy and Tacitus, who wrote of Roman conquests. And since the 15th century, humanists had cultivated this ancient art of writing history. And they reflected often on the art of composing histories, which resulted in numerous humanist treatises on the ars historica, or the art of history, including one that was written by Barlaeus's good friend and next-door neighbor, Gerardus Johannes Vossius, a prolific historian whose Ars Historica, published in 1623, was the most highly esteemed book on the subject written in the 17th century. Among other things, this handbook for historians argued for the importance of composing speeches for the characters in one's histories, even when there was no factual evidence for those speeches. Historical accuracy was, of course, important, but for the humanist, accuracy needed to be coupled with eloquentia, right? That this was that special capacity of a well-told story to move the reader. The writing of history, in other words, was more than writing words well on the page. Like Alberti's painted Historia, its model was the oration, with its performative power to move the auditor. It's not surprising, then, to see Barlaeus in his history of Dutch Brazil following his friend's advice. So not only does he quote extensively from Johann Maurits's correspondence, but in numerous instances he puts speeches into his mouth, particularly on those highly performative occasions when the count stands before his men and incites them to take up arms against the enemy. You will fight bravely, doing your utmost on this occasion presented you by heaven. Nowhere can the Spaniards be conquered more surely than along these shores, and so on, and a lot of that sort of thing. And indeed, one could describe Barlaeus's whole history of Dutch Brazil as a 340-page speech. And in fact, he invites us to do that with the opening words of the book in his dedication to Johann Maurits. I offer you Brazil, most illustrious Count, radiating the brilliance of your supreme rule and military glory. If the country were able to speak and could address you, it would surrender itself to you. Brazil, of course, could not speak by itself, and so Barlaeus, the historian orator, is obliged to speak for it. And what stands in for Brazil in Barlaeus's book, providing the visible but mute occasion for the author's speech, are Franz Post's etched landscapes. They're dotted with figures and forts and other details, but as I've suggested, these are the remainders of historical event, and they're all but swallowed into the silence of these airiest of Dutch landscapes. If we want to find a more active voice in these prints, we'll have to look instead to those wonderfully inventive winged banners that float in the sky above Post's landscapes. You see a detail of it. These are a type of trophy ornament that label the sites and their importance vis-a-vis Barlaeus's text. And the landscapes need these labels since, lacking any clear argument, they're not self-evidently linked to the narrated history. That this print shows the mouth of the Paraíba River, for example, is by no means obvious. This could be any body of water. We need this winged messenger to arrive and deliver its identification to us. Wings are attributes of fame and of history as well, historia, who announces events and thus brings fame. And indeed, some of the banners in that handful of prints that do specify specific, that do depict specific military events, include sounding trumpets, signifying the publication, the making public of Johann Maurits's victories. So this etching, for example, shows a naval battle and the burning of the sugar mills by the Dutch in All Saints Bay, and you can see that sounding trumpet puffing forth that smoke and sound in the sky. Franz Post has introduced these elements into his engravings in order to accommodate his silent landscapes to Barlaeus's eloquent Historia. And yet that gap between landscape and event is not quite filled by these efforts towards the reintroduction of an argument. The winged banner that enters here like a deus ex machina to save the landscape for history simply begs the question, to what extent can the writer's, the historian's voice account for Post's landscapes? And what I find remarkable about these landscapes is not their capacity to deliver the story of Johann Mauritz's deeds in Brazil to us on their own, but the way in which they ask us to pause and reflect on the way that we narrate history through pictures. What Franz Post's engravings say to me is that landscape will always be awaiting the entrance of the storyteller's voice onto its stage. And this finally seems to me something essential about the work that printed images perform in the early modern travel narrative, which is a bit like the role that the reproductions on the screen perform for an art historian. They serve as the background against which an account of distant lands or of the history of art can be voiced. Thank you.
We have time for questions. This is working. Does anyone have a question? Okay.
Thank you so much for this. It was really wonderful. My question is kind of a simplistic one, I think. But about the banners, is it surprising to you that they're not angels or eagles or birds or something, that they're kind of inanimate things that are performing this task? Or is that something you've seen before?
Not really surprising in the sense, I mean, he could have, added a little cherub's head to these, for example. Which would not be uncommon. I mean, the figures of history and fame were often personified in that way. So I think that's clear, simply a choice that he could have made had he wanted to. I think the choice of not to do that, I suppose it was a choice just to kind of simplify these, without any virtually no human presence at all in these landscapes. He sort of maintains that by choosing not to personify these banners and simply give them those wings of fame. But they still, even without the head, the personification, the wings themselves serve as enough of a tie to that emblem that everybody would know, right? Looking at this, that this is fame, this is history. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Was someone else over here?
Thank you for this talk. It was great. I'm wondering a little bit more about the Native groups you discussed. You speak about them mostly in the past tense, and I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about how these groups exist today, and if you know anything about like contemporary cultural practices and how they may have changed or not changed.
Yeah, that's a good question. I could not give you as full of an answer about that as many others could give. I mean, the Tupinamba, in the way that they existed and lived at the time that Larry encountered them, I mean, they have a long history tied up with the long and complex history of Brazil. But there are native groups in Brazil that still speak versions of the Tupi-Guarani language and still maintain some of the traditions. So the performance that I showed you, the dance that I showed you, continues to be performed by groups in Brazil in a way that involves a lot of the characteristics that were described by. Oh, I'm sorry, they can't hear me. That were described by Larry. So there is a continuation of a lot of the traditions. But again, I could not give you as full of a description of that as many who have studied this more than me can.
Other questions?
There's one over there.
Sorry. Thanks, that was great. I have a sort of open-ended question and a larger comment and a smaller one, so I'm not quite sure exactly how to do this. But I think I'll start with these images since they're on the screen. And you talk about them as an absence of action, essentially. But the sorts of action you talk about as potentially filling that space are effectively conflict of different kinds. At least those are the examples that you gave. It seems to me, that, on the other hand, that we could also read this as absolutely full of content and full of action, essentially, in their placidness. This is full of possibility. It is full of peace. It is overflowing with peace, almost, we could say, under the control of the Dutch. And we see it pushed very much in the background, the fortresses and the warship and so on. It's a sort of counterintuitive or sort of reading the negative space in that, but I think that's not accidental. I don't.
Yeah, well, it's a great observation. I mean, I guess I wouldn't argue with that. I mean, these are full of peace, full of placidity, but I would at the same time, say that what are peace and placidity here? They're emptiness. They're lack of action. Their silence.
Right,
Those are very meaningful.
Which may make dull pictures, but it makes an excellent sort of representation of Jan Maurits's reign in Brazil.
Oh, absolutely.
Which is exactly what he was supposed to do.
This is inventing peace in Brazil in the
Yes.
same way that Vermeer for Weschler was inventing
Exactly.
peace in Holland. Yeah.
A short comment, when we saw the drawing by Grelot, and you pointed out that he's sitting there, one, his name is right next to it, but also he's sitting there with a whole bunch of surveying tools. I think they're surveying tools.
Yes.
Which seems to me that it's making a bigger claim still about the sort of scientific accuracy of this.
Yeah.
Everything has been measured and
Yeah.
so we have a compass, a square, and calipers, and
Right. The tools of accurate vision.
exactly.
And
In other words,
perspective.
it is saying this is not just an impressionistic thing. It is a scientific document.
That's right. Yeah. No, enhancing his claims to the accuracy of this view for sure. Absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out.
Hi, once again, thank you for back here.
Oh.
Once again, thank you for the lecture, but the question, would the contemporary audience have read that Peace and Tranquility as, well, not Peace and Tranquility, as the emptiness, as the Dutch bringing civilization to this world, as if what the bands depicted earlier doing their dance, well, they didn't have history.
Yeah, no, I think very, very much so. I mean, there is a message behind that placidity about Johann Maurits's reign. That this is that's again tied to Barlaeus's own sort of humanist language of that. Just as the Romans conquered and brought Roman civilization to distant lands, so too are the Dutch bringing civilization and bringing peace to these savage areas. I mean, those are basically his words, right, from the book itself. And I think he's guiding readers in that respect, how to read these landscapes, how to see them as the pacifying of a Brazil that's war-torn before the Dutch, but delivered back to them by Maurits as a new, serene place.
Question up here.
Thank you for the talk. I have a question about the vegetation that frames the piece, the placidity. It seems to be on the post one. Yes, most of them include, right, some very detailed vegetation, which on the one hand frames the entire landscape. But I'm wondering if, I don't know, if you see that as doing something different than the rest of the scene, as serving another function.
I mean, it is tied up with, this is an interesting and much more involved kind of travel account than, say, Jean de Lery's, because this is about the Dutch. It's a military expedition, and so on the one hand, It's about those battles and that effort to pacify Brazil that I kind of emphasized in what I was saying. But as I also mentioned, the part of this expedition was bringing a team of artists and scientists to Brazil to map it, to botanize, to describe the peoples encountered there. There are many, many visual documents that come out of the Dutch colony in Brazil. And these individuals are talking to each other. So Franz Post was there with other artists who were describing specifically the flora of the region, and they were looking at each other's works, and that information makes its way into Post's landscape. So in that respect, that vegetation is part of a systematic surveying of Brazil. And I mean, I suppose that can bring us back to Grelot's various the tools that are surrounding behind him, that these are landscapes, but also part of the Dutch surveying of all aspects of Brazil. Does that get at your question, or is there?
Yes, it does.
Okay. All right.
This isn't my field at all, but thank you. It's very interesting. But I was wondering how these kinds of images, whether we're talking about the earlier ones you were showing or the landscape here, compare, if there's any comparison to be made at all, with similar kinds of travel depictions and engravings or whatever from other imperial powers at the time in the New World. So were there anything comparable at this time coming to and from Spain, from England, from France, and so on?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, there are a lot of illustrated travel texts, travel accounts being published. Fewer from Spain, where there is less interest in publicizing and information about colonies and less illustration. Therefore, in the texts, less effort to put out maps and such, which would convey a lot of information. But again, throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, you see many accounts from, especially in terms of illustrated ones, especially from the north. Theodore de Bry's is, as I mentioned, would be one great example. It's published in 13 volumes over 44 years, between 1590 and 1634, and so lots of travel accounts coming out in that. But you know, there are other accounts of the French in North America that are being published at this time. I'm trying to think of, you know, I showed you Hans Staden's mid-16th century account of his travels in Brazil that then de Bry republishes. Many of these are being recycled again through de Bry. So again, the short answer to your question is yes, especially in Northern Europe, there is an effort to, an interest in publicizing these, because, you know, some of them in particular are, you know, one for various reasons. I mean, one reason is to glorify Dutch prowess, right? Which the Dutch have a great deal of interest in doing, especially in 1647. You know, just a couple years before the Dutch Republic wins its independence from Spain, right? So this is this effort, for example, needs to be understood in the context of the war with Spain and that struggle, that long struggle for Dutch independence. But there are, you know, to give you another example, the first volume of de Bry's book focuses on the Roanoke colony in Virginia, and with text by an English scientist, Thomas Harriot, describing the commodities, the flora and fauna of the region, describing the peoples, their customs, and presenting it as a peaceful area awaiting English colonization, right? That they're just kind of waiting there in open arms for us, ready to make your lives easy in Virginia. So a lot of them have ulterior motives along those. You know, publishing knowledge, presenting knowledge about the flora and fauna, about the peoples, but often with a motive towards settlement, or military celebration, other reasons.
Thank you very much, Michael. And thank you all for joining us this evening. Please join us in thanking our speaker one more time.